everyone. Welcome to our follow-up question and answers for our luncheon presentation 2 weeks ago with Tony Griffin. I'm so grateful for all of you taking the time to be with us here today. And first and foremost, I wanted to thank all of our sponsors that help make our work possible, especially Home Leasing for being our presenting sponsor for the lecture series for 4 years now. Our other major contributing sponsors, ESL Charitable, as well as the Community Preservation Corporation, our continued funding from NISCA, and our many, many sponsors for both the lecture series and the luncheon event, as well as other supporting groups, such as our Circle of Friends. I want to thank our staff, especially Monica Reifenstein, for being our behind-the-scenes Zoom wizard. And I want to thank our board of directors for all that they contribute to our organization. With that, there was so much wonderful information that Tony shared with us. So I'd like to introduce our speakers and get started. So looking forward to a very engaging, enlightening discussion. So with that, I want to introduce Nana Andoh. He's a former board member for the Community Design Center and former professor of architecture at the Rochester Institute of Technology Graduate Program for Architecture. And Kate Mariner, who is a friend and the Wilmot Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Visual and Cultural Studies at the University of Rochester. So thank you both for joining us. I wanted to welcome you on, and I was just so impressed with the amount of information that Tony shared, the breadth of her work. I know that the work that she did in Detroit was dated Detroit Future Cities 2012, so certainly there's a little bit of history there. Curious to know if you were familiar with Tony's work prior and what you thought of anything that particularly stood out in the presentation to you. Any aha moments or takeaways that you want to share?
I can go first. I had not heard of Tony's work before I saw this talk. Design, space, place, these are sort of new areas of inquiry for me. But something I was really struck by was the Just Cities Index. I think she had a slide up with it. It's like these 50 or so values that we should be taking into account when we think about space and designing for a just city. And I think it would be a really interesting exercise to hold that list of values up against the new comprehensive plan and just see where those different values are showing up in that plan. And one of the other takeaways that I got from it, which I thought was really interesting and I would love to discuss more with others, is just this notion that Tony brought up that we should be thinking not about equity, but instead about justice, and sort of this shift from language of equity to language of justice. She didn't go into a lot of detail about sort of like why justice over equity, but I think that sort of the merits of a justice framework versus an equity framework is something really interesting to think with. I'll end there.
Okay, and I, like Kate, was not aware of the kind of work that Tony has been working on, but I was fortunate enough to attend the Congress for New Urbanism, which was held in Detroit maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and to see the impact of the work that is being done. And you can really see how the instruments she talked about with how to design a good place is beginning to take hold, right? But there's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done. There's some things that are, in my opinion, questionable, being done for the sake of the people in the room, not necessarily an all-inclusive thought process. So I still do think that whilst she's headed in the right direction with a lot of the work that she's doing, there's still a lot of people who need to be brought into the conversation.
Great. In reference to that, Nana, I know that in some of the project, the personal work that she was doing, she shared that interest in bridging the gap between being able to engage the community. You know, the one statement she made is outreach is not engagement, which is a very valid point. We think that just by reaching out to people that we're doing engagement. So I think that's something that certainly we as an organization can take to heart and find ways to build better tools for engagement, since that is something that we strive to do. Relative to your point, Kate, a quote that she had that struck me was, "I believe that equity, while a necessary aspiration, is too neutral, and therefore not sufficient in describing the pain, the hurt, and malice that must be understood in order to heal and correct the acts of injustice." And I really found that statement to be incredibly powerful, especially since we tend to use that word equity so often in well-meaning ways, and really understanding, well, that's just kind of sugarcoating it, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger, though, is that justice, like equity, becomes evacuated of meaning, right? Like, because I think that equity, we started to use the word equity in place of something like diversity, because diversity was too politically neutral and was being overused and used in sort of problematic ways. And so I think there is a danger that we just sort of shift to a new language that then becomes neutral over time through overuse. And so I think it's important to be really precise with our language and to really kind of try not to evacuate the meaning out of these terms.
Yeah, I agree. And to that point, again, one of the things that I found very interesting is that she did recognize that point and went very specifically into defining these 5 different types of justice in very specific terms. So that was very interesting. Well, we have a general question. How can community-centered design help us to address issues of structural inequity and racial injustice in our community? So that's kind of a broad question, kind of a big lift. Curious if you have any comments on that.
Ladies first.
Nice.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I have many thoughts, but I wonder, Maria, like, I would actually love to hear you, like, what the CDC's sort of definition of community-centered design is. Because I think there's lots of different ways we could think about community-centered design, and a lot of different things we could sort of point to illustrate community-centered design, but I'm wondering if there's a working definition.
That's a good point. I've been striving to use kind of the placemaking definition as a foundational element of our work. And what I love about the placemaking definition is that it's a people-centered process. So for me to say a community-centered design would be something that is grassroots, that's founded in partnering with and listening to the people in the neighborhood of the community that are being impacted. So that would be the definition I would use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have lots of thoughts on this. So I guess maybe I'll just share some brief ones and we can continue the conversation. I think, like, the point that Tony makes about outreach not being engagement is really salient, really important. I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is that the relationship building that's at the heart of sort of authentic and true engagement is something that takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And time is sort of increasingly something that seems like we have less and less of. And so I'm an ethnographer, which means that I, do sort of human-centered research with communities and write about their experiences, their stories, their life ways. And that is like a sort of a painstakingly slow process. And often I feel like in academia, I can sort of afford to take all of that time, but outside of academia, it's a little bit harder to sort of invest the kinds of slow, repeated interactions, reciprocal exchanges that build those relationships that are really important to engagement beyond sort of like outreach and having a focus group or just, collecting feedback in that way and then bringing something back to the community.
I agree. Nana, anything to contribute?
Sure. So I think when we start talking about structural inequity and racial justice, we have to be very careful about what our role is as designers and trying to understand that it is and we are incapable of providing a single solution to solve all those problems. So if we take a look at a place like Park Avenue, and what does Park Avenue have? And we take a look at a place like Beechwood, and what does Beechwood have? And what does it not have? And now we're starting to talk about structural inequities where maybe there might be disinvestment in some places as opposed to investment in some places. But at the same time, racism can happen in both places. Just because I've designed a really beautiful place doesn't mean racism is going to be absent. So that is where we start to talk about racial injustice, and where some people feel or are made to feel like they don't belong. And that is a societal problem that design cannot solve. And so I always see these two things as things that we can try to use to work together to solve a common problem. But as designers, we should not take on the burden of trying to solve societal problems. There are some things that the legal system in society needs to address and solve, like racism and white supremacy. And then there are things that design can solve, like creating equitable spaces.
Yeah, I agree. And I know that we as an organization have been trying to define, what are the areas, for example, the term design equity. What are the areas that relate to our mission that we can actually work towards helping build understanding around, education around, projects around, and it's kind of hard to sift through what is within our wheelhouse and what isn't. So I'm curious, Nana, can you share with us maybe a better understanding of what you believe design equity is and how that applies?
So I tend to see design equity and broadly as a place that is inclusive by a diversity of races, by social income, a place where everyone feels welcome. So what that means physically to me is when we take a look at our zoning, for instance, that if I have a place that is designed primarily with large detached single family lots, only some people are able to afford those buildings or that typology, and you end up with a place that is homogeneous both by race and by financial means. And then when we talk about affordable housing, you end up with another end of the spectrum. So when we talk about design equity, we're talking about trying to bridge the gap and bring those two ends of the spectrum together by trying to create something that is more mixed use, more inclusive, different ends of the demographic spectrum, both racially, economically, and everything else. And when you're that used to seeing people who don't look like you in the same place, you're able to live with them in a much more tolerable way, as opposed to feeling like you don't belong when you show up to a place that was not designed or originally for you, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I know that in a more literal way, we talk about design equity in the sense that design has always seemed to be a product for the affluent, for those people who could afford it. And for an example, when we speak of affordable housing, it tends to be sturdy, well-built, strong materials, oftentimes kind of drab and boring and lacking in design thinking. So in a very literal way, can we create beautiful places using the variety of materials that are available to us for everyone? That's one thinking that comes to mind. I know that you brought up, Kate, the design Just City Index, which provided a ton of information, which we haven't really been able to dive into in detail, but it seems that it was created as a resource specifically for municipalities and government bodies to use as a reference point. And I know that on the participant list, I don't see all of our participants readily because I have a split screen, but I know that we do have some people from the city hopefully attending this Q&A. So I'm curious to know from anybody in the audience if they have, what their experience has been, if they had any awareness of this Just City Index, or whether they've been able to look at it and see how it might apply to things in Rochester, especially since we've just recently completed our comprehensive plan. But do you see this Just City Index, helping you in the work that you're currently doing, Kate? I know that you're involved in a research project right now, and different things kind of fit into it. And does this have a role or a way to inform some of the work that you're currently doing?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't dove into it with a lot of depth yet, but I think this actually speaks to something I was going to raise earlier to piggyback off of one of Nana's comments, is that I think one field alone perhaps cannot solve these large, seemingly intractable structural problems, but I think that's where collaboration can be really fruitful. So as an anthropologist, the idea that there's a designer out there that made a Just Cities Index that I can then, not only sort of examine from a position of critique, but also sort of apply it to the work that I'm doing, is super useful. And I think that there are ways that designers can work with, think about the community a little more broadly, right? Can work with residents. I've seen designers do this. I've seen designers work with artists. I've seen designers work with activists. Designers can work with social scientists. Designers can work with humanists. I think if we really want to think about how to design a space for racial justice and equity, the designer has to work with these other kinds of people that bring these other kinds of expertise. And I think that is a way that we can actually work together to try to solve these problems. I think that the other thought that I had as you two were talking is that this might just be a disciplinary thing, but I keep wanting definitions. And so I think design, to me at least, design is not just beautiful things. Design is all around us, right? So a prison is designed. Public housing is designed. And so I think that to think about design a little more broadly helps us understand better the ways in which design functions to include or exclude. Design impacts people's lives no matter what their socioeconomic status is. There's a specific kind of design that's perhaps only accessible to the affluent. But design as a whole is shaping all kinds of people's everyday lives. And so I think that also helps us kind of connect the design world to these larger problems of inequity and social justice.
Yeah, I agree. It's in some of the presentations that I give, there are 2 points that we make. One is that we have to incorporate issues of equity and social justice in everything that we do. So every profession has a component where they can impact this issue. And the other thing that I like to share is that design is everything. Everything is designed, and everything should be created with some intention. And so if we know what our goals are and we understand the power of that intention, then we can really be very creative and hopefully coming up with some wonderful solutions. We're gonna have a question here from a student who wants to know, do you have any advice for architecture planning and design students who are interested in design for the Just City, especially if their institution's curriculum and instruction doesn't give the space for design equity?
I do. Take history classes, take sociology classes, take political science classes, take classes where you are going to learn how to theorize power and how power works, if that's not part of your design curriculum. I think the thing I just keep thinking about as we're having this conversation is that design is really about power, if you want to think about equity. And there are people in the community that do not have high school diplomas that are very sophisticated theorists of power. And so there are lots of different ways where we can sort of get this expertise about how power works. But I think without that, it's really difficult to be able to design for justice or to understand how these structures are working.
And to that, I would add, if possible, start going to planning board meetings and any kind of meetings that are widely advertised and open to the public, because that is when you'll get to see the people behind the big table talk about what they're interested in, and then the people in the community, on the other hand, talking about what they need and how those two things often collide. And then as a student, you might be able to bring those issues into the safety of the classroom and start to address that as, say, an independent study or some kind of a capstone project. But that kind of dynamic will really help you be able to apply theory to practice.
Thank you, Nana. We have a question from Scott Wagner. Is it even possible to change the design paradigm from private property and private owner-centric to social and community-centric design? We attempt to do so with community development standards, zoning, and the like, but exemptions and developer concessions consistently undercut these. Can we create a social structure in which designers are uniformly responsible to and responsive to the social community first, and to the developer client second? We have this argument all the time about the political structure of our country, right? This is the community-oriented versus the individual-oriented political structure. So either of you want to comment on that?
I can just jump in and say that typically, if you're asking a developer to be altruistic and design for the community without their eye on their profit margin, then chances are that is very unlikely to happen unless there's policy that incentivizes it. And so for me, my thought about development has always been that, yes, you want to engage the community, but if the community has really adverse reactions to that proposal, then it is up to the community to also try to come up with a solution. And that is where places like the CDCR become quite invaluable, because you can be an asset to the community to then come up with that counter proposal, which would then maybe go back to the developer to say, can we have some kind of a compromise? And in the end, we have to realize that we cannot make everyone happy, but as many boxes that we can check to ensure that everyone's needs are being met, and to make that process as transparent as possible is the best way to go.
I know that one of the things I've talked about as part of the Charette process is one of the things that we like to do in the Charette process is start with a blank slate. So I say that we're unique in that we're not asking people to respond to an existing proposal, but that we're giving people the opportunity to kind of dreamscape their pie in the sky ideas. But through the Charette process, we have an exchange of information. One is the community has the opportunity to start to explore these visions of their place. And we as an organization have a responsibility to educate about the tools and the strategies, and then start to share information about what are the different filters that a project has to pass through in order to be a viable project. And certainly the economics of it is an important aspect. And then there are a lot of other things. Does it fit into the context? Is there the appropriate zoning in place to allow for these kinds of things to happen? But the actual process can be a really great two-way exchange of information and knowledge. So I have a question here from Kimberly Russell. The city and county are putting together a commission to address structural racism that will be led by former Mayor Bill Johnson. How can we advocate to make sure the design community has a seat at the table?
I don't have an answer to that necessarily, but I think just asking is a good place to start. I mean, I think I saw recently that they were collecting applications for people to sit, sorry, I have a cat here, for people to sit on the board. She must be the center of attention. And so I think like it's worth just, whoever's in charge getting in touch with that person and saying, you know, I'm a member of the design community. I would really like to be involved in this. Like, here are some resources on design justice. Here are some reasons I think that designers should be involved in this process. And I don't see why they can't be.
So we'll have to lean in.
Yeah, and I also do think that while I did say that the design of a beautiful space does not necessarily mean that racism isn't going to happen there, we do have to understand that because of the way the built environment is structured, historically, some places almost invite racist behavior and racist incidents to occur with much more frequency than some other places. And as design professionals, we maybe have the background to be able to inform how transformation of some of these spaces can bring about some positive change once we also build in the policy to, as Kate said, to collaborate, to figure out ways in which we can work together to bring about positive change. And we need as many different professions as possible to come to the table to start to talk about what do we need to do as a profession to address structural racism, and what do other people need, and at what points do our needs overlap, and how can we then all come together to work on this together as a community.
Yeah, so kind of looking at it as a multidisciplinary commission where everybody is working through their particular expertise to solve the same problem.
Exactly.
We have a question from Peter Peters. If we agree that design is related to power, what kind of matrix have you found successful in enabling all voices to be empowered at the table? This might be directed to you, Kate.
A matrix.
What kind of matrix have you found successful in enabling all voices to be empowered?
I don't know if I found one.
I was going to say, I don't know if there's a matrix that exists.
Yeah, I don't think there is. I think often we imagine that radical inclusion is possible, and I don't know that it is, but I don't think the fact that we can't represent every single voice means that we shouldn't try. I guess that's my response. And I think this also speaks to something else I've been thinking about, and something that sort of came up in a little side conversation we had before we went live, which is this notion of justice in a just city. This also speaks back to this question about sort of like how to create justice within a larger capitalist or otherwise unjust social formation. Justice is an ongoing process. It's not a destination at which we will arrive and then be done. And so, like, I don't think we can think about it as like the end point, that like, ooh, once we finally like figure out like the perfect matrix or the perfect design principles, or we check all of these boxes, like we will have a just space, right? Because like human life is dynamic, politics are dynamic, the world is changing all the time, especially right now. We're in a rapidly changing social milieu. So I think that the most important takeaway is that justice is something we will be working on forever, because like things will constantly be changing, right? And so I think that we have to be flexible, we have to be adaptable, we have to understand justice as an ongoing process, not just an object that we will achieve.
Yes, agreed. There's a lot, it took a long time to get here. There are very intentional policies that were implemented, and we have to take the time to learn, to understand, and then to hopefully try to create solutions that, again, also will take time to hopefully succeed. We have a question from, and this is the problem with removing my glasses. Madeline Britt wants to know, what are some ways you envision planners and designers engage in the police abolition and defunding movement, given the historical and current use of police as a means of enforcing racist and exclusionary planning processes? So there's a big one. I know that I actually thought about this very specifically, because on East Main Street, there is a proposal for a new police precinct or building that's taking up a few blocks and removing some vacant homes. And I'm wondering how what is currently happening right now might impact the future of that, as we start to understand this issue of a surveilled state. So do either of you have any comments on that?
I hope I don't dive into some controversy here, but so I think we have to take a step back and look at who makes up the police department. And they are probably people we know, right? And once that goes away, or if we defund them, and so that the police department essentially is responding to something specific, and we essentially put those funds away for social workers and some other profession to respond to things that they are essentially experts at, that to me seems like a very rational way to approach things, right? And I personally think that the police departments as they stand tend to be overburdened with things that are not within their realm of expertise. And typically when you're trained to respond to everything as this is the worst case scenario, it tends to not end well, depending on what your implicit biases are. And when guns get involved, it can be fatal for, you know, oftentimes people who look like me. So that is where I come in very strongly to say that, yes, I do believe in defunding to allow for other people to be first responders, not necessarily people with badges and guns. Now, with that being said, how do we bring design into the mix? And I think that is where we start to tread on things that might not necessarily be in our best interest, because I think when we start to talk about, as Jane Jacobs would say, like eyes on the street and things like that, we're now putting people in charge of being the police of the neighborhood. And we all have our implicit biases as well, right? And that is when we start to call, quote unquote, that the police on our neighbors because they don't belong or they don't look like us, or, you know, something else might be happening that we may not be aware of. So I do think, yes, defund the police, figure out how to ship those funds to other experts to become first responders. But at the same time, as designers, we shouldn't be putting ourselves in a position to be liable for trying to design spaces that become de facto police states, if you will, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Kate, do you have any comments?
Yeah, that's a
From your perspective, I'm sure you have plenty to say.
A big topic. I mean, I think so. Just to speak to sort of the role that designers can play in ongoing efforts to rethink or abolish policing. I mean, I think designers have a big role to play, and I think that designers have actually already done a lot of work sort of critiquing modes of surveillance, modes of policing, modes of marking certain spaces as safe or dangerous, and then like the ways that those markings as safe or dangerous get translated into like innocent and criminal bodies depending on where they are in space. And so I think there's actually a lot of literature on this. I think Toni Griffin, in the interventions that she was having her design students do, a lot of them were actually about policing and crime and things like that. And so I think this is another area where collaborations between designers, activists, people, you know, with a knowledge of criminal justice, criminology, social scientists who, you know, critique those structures and the ways that we like think of what a crime is and what causes criminality, and the sort of like screwed up relationships between notions of crime and race and gender and all of these other things. I think that's where the power lies, is in those collaborations where you can bring those different kinds of expertise and experience together to really re-engineer and redesign a way for people to feel safe and secure.
Yeah, I agree, Kate, in regards to space. The other side of this coin is kind of like, how do we help bring about a shift in cultural thinking about what the police's role is, and how do police, you know, there's been a lot of talk about police being servants of the community, and how do they return to playing that role in the community of service to the community in a way that's positive and impactful, and without having to use punishment or force or violence or et cetera. So it seems like we, as a community, some community has bought into this idea that we need to be forceful and we need to, you know, hold people accountable. But there was also, I mean, some people in a chat on Facebook were talking about, what if a policeman pulled you over for not having, you know, your tail light out, and offering a resource where you can go fix it. And it's a totally different idea than, I'm going to issue you a ticket because you're violating the law. So I know these cultural shifts are very different and hard, but, you know, maybe there's ways that we can also, through these collective conversations, start to shift the way people see the role of the police being in our community. So that's some food for thought there. We have a question from Julia Maddox. How can organizations integrate community-centered design justice into the fabric of their identity, moving beyond the perfunctory? And excuse me, trying to keep my glasses off because of the glare, but moving beyond the perfunctory Black Lives Matter statements and into long-term strategy and actions. And that is an incredible question. I know it's a question that we are grappling with as an organization. Again, trying to, because of the nature of our organization, I mean, we're community design centers that were born out of a desire to provide services to populations that needed these particular services. We need to have a better understanding, and then also try to come up with strategies and solutions that we can try to implement. I don't know about Nana or Kate, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I know Julia, and I think maybe like we're on the same page, sort of thinking about the university as one of these institutions that we're most familiar with. And yeah, it's a big question. I think I keep sort of getting hung up on identity, because when I think about sort of the long-term actions and sort of authentic interventions that we're imagining in contrast to the flashy PR statements that say a lot but don't actually do anything, I think like one of the things that's true about that kind of action is that it isn't always visible. And it isn't always marketable, especially at first, before there are results that we can tell people about. And going back to sort of this notion of relationship building, like that's really kind of like invisible, like not glamorous work that's really meaningful and really important. And I think that, yeah, it's very difficult to get institutions or organizations that are concerned with image to invest in those, like, again, longer term, less visible, less flashy demonstrations of commitment to a long-term goal. And I think we see this also in things like Black Lives Matter, where protests, while they are very important, get all of the sort of visibility. And then there's a lot of behind the scenes work that no one really knows about and that no one really gets credit for. And so I think that the kind of action is going to be the stuff that like isn't sexy to put on a brochure right away. And so it's harder, we live in a culture of instant gratification. It's harder to convince people to like put resources and money there when they can't see the immediate reaction, even more so when it's against this like big social problem that feels very intractable, right? Like racism, you know, like how could an institution possibly like solve racism? Yeah, so that's my two cents.
Yeah, and I would just add that typically when it comes to community-centered design or community-based design, more often than not, in lower income communities, there's nothing scarier than seeing a bunch of, you know, well-dressed architects walking around with clipboards, documenting stuff, because you know change is happening that you weren't involved in. And so if we start to be much more empathetic to the fact that there are people who live in these communities who are probably, well, not probably, they are definite experts of their community, and to begin to engage them first before we even start to show up with our clipboards, right? Just go sit on a porch and talk to someone and ask them what that community needs. And let's make that a best practices. Let's make that a policy. And that is when it's no longer the PR stuff, right? It becomes something that we do on a regular basis. And I guarantee you that the outcomes of those projects, once the community feels ownership and feels involved in the entire process, it becomes a more positive outcome as opposed to the fear of gentrification and displacement.
Yeah, I agree. So there's a lot of introspection that needs to happen, not only on a personal level, but on an organizational level, and understanding how you have perhaps as an institution contributed to some of these problems. And then, of course, what are the types of actions that you can take to try to repair those things. So, and that is true of, again, any profession, any institution. We've all contributed, and we all have to find how do we contribute to the solution. In talking particularly about academic institutions, I know the students have been incredibly engaged in really making some very strong demands of their institutions of higher learning, and they've been I think really demonstrating again the power of collaboration, organization, and really kind of putting their values out there to say, you know, we would support you if you're willing to do X, Y, and Z. So it's been, have a lot of faith in our young people who are really intentionally finding ways to make a difference. So it's on us all to do the same. With that, I know that, again, there's just so much to explore with the information that Tony shared. I know that, again, back to the comp plan, we had we have a wonderful framework that really outlines very well what the many goals are for development through our city. And I'm hopeful that the work that Tony has done, Tony and her team, and some of these student projects help to illustrate things that we can borrow and adapt into our own fabric of development for our city. So hopefully that will be a very valuable resource for local governments throughout our region to use and to share. I think Roger had a question that was a big question that we wanted to kind of share with all the participants, and hopefully they can participate in the conversation. Is there a community in the US that embodies all of the design justice aspects that we strive for? Diverse schools, excellent public transportation, diverse housing racially, diverse income population, beautiful walkway public realm. And it was this huge question that when we were speaking behind the scenes a little bit, we were wondering, well, you know, does this place exist? And since so many people through the region travel or work in specific areas, perhaps you have examples of where some places doing even some part of this right. So please chime in if you have any suggestions for places that you see are moving in the right direction, and even one of these particular points that Roger's making. As far as for us as panelists, I think we thought we really don't know of a place that's doing it all right at this moment in time. Any other contributions?
Not really, because there are just so many places in the years in the United States that I love to go and visit, but you spend time walking around and you get to a place where the hairs in your neck start to rise, right? That I feel like, you know, this might be a dangerous place. Or you go to a place where it's wonderful, but then the education system is not perfect, you know. So I think there are tons of places where they try to get as much right, if you will, but I haven't yet seen a place where, you know, 100 across the board where everything is perfect. Because if there was such a place, I think I'll probably be there by now. So
Yeah, I agree.
I was saying earlier that like it's hard to create a bubble of justice when the larger sort of context that it's in continues to operate in unjust ways, right? This is probably an imperfect example, but it's the one that's like foremost in my mind, which is like trying to keep coronavirus out of any space, right? Like in New York, our cases are very low, but elsewhere in the world and in the country, they're high, which means that they could rise here at any time because people move around and we're all connected. So the idea that we could just design a place that's sort of like free from all of these things that are afflicting everyone everywhere is just not possible. But again, like that sounds pessimistic, but I guess I would just say that just because the world is not perfect doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to create a place like that. Doesn't mean that we can't keep that place in our mind as an aspiration. And that we shouldn't try to like keep working towards solving these larger issues that are coloring all of our lives everywhere.
Thank you. I'm reading, some people have posted some questions in the chats, which I am not monitoring, so I apologize if you've had a question and I haven't gotten to it. But there is a comment, I would say, that I want to acknowledge from Julius Anwuka from the Abia State in Nigeria. So thank you for joining us. But the comment is, touch on the African underdevelopment, the fuel activating racism and loss of identity. Economic and human empowerment of Africa will solve systemic racism in the Western world. If not, forget it. Let's go that direction. I see light in that narrative. So I don't know if there's a way to respond. I saw that more as a comment, but you're welcome to think on that. I wanted to acknowledge the question. And go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that unfortunately I would have to disagree with that sentiment, primarily because I am also African and I think I have been educated, and when I am here in the United States where most of my education did happen, I will often get comments about why can't other Black people be like you? So it actually fuels racism, not diminish it. So I think we have to be very careful and mindful about what we say with regards to empowering Africa to then empower the United States, because those are two very different systems. And I just will not touch that with a 10-foot pole, in my opinion.
Thank you, Nana. I have a question here that is just kind of a general question. It says, what can we learn from European cities? I guess in regard to racism that as we see it in America. And I personally have some comment in the sense that I'm a foreign-born person. I was born in Venezuela, and when I have conversations with my mom about racism, she doesn't understand racism in America because the system in Venezuela was quite different, as I'm sure it was probably different in other countries as well. So I'm curious if you see places, this particular question was, you know, what can we learn from Europe, but are there other places that we can learn from? Or is this problem particular to America because of this somewhat unique history that we have?
A big question. I mean, I think that, yeah, like a really good lesson is that race doesn't operate the same way everywhere. The United States actually does have a pretty unique history with regard to the way that like racial formation happened here and the reverberation it continues to have. But I think that that doesn't mean that there aren't similar structures of oppression, whether they're religious or ethnic or gendered in other parts of the world. As far as European cities go, I don't know that I have much to offer there. But again, like the history is so different in European cities than it is here. And European cities certainly have all kinds of problems related to sort of the inclusion of refugee populations, immigrant populations, religious persecution. They aren't those sort of like perfectly designed places that we we think of. So I'm not sure that in the US, like what we would want to do is emulate European cities necessarily, but maybe make something that works for us here.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%, primarily because as designers, we often see the European cities as a wonderful place to be, but what we're not seeing is kind of the underbelly of racism that still exists, primarily with the refugee population that is increasingly coming, where some Europeans are now beginning to see that as either them not conforming to their way of life and living in their own enclaves, and or taken away from their resources and becoming state dependent. And so we're actually now beginning to see a much more visceral reaction to people who are trying to come into the European countries from Syria and from other war-torn places. And it's, you know, we were just watching a show on Netflix, I believe, called Hate Thy Neighbor, where this guy goes around and interviews primarily people in Northern Europe about why they hold racist views, and it's always against immigrants who are coming in. And so while the streets are beautiful to walk around and the plazas are wonderful to sit in, just know that there's still that kind of undercurrent of a visceral reaction going on. And surprisingly, even in Sweden, their new emblem is a Confederate flag, because they see that as a sign of rebellion against their state. And that is what they now use as a sign of hate against the immigrants who are coming into Sweden. So this problem exists everywhere. We just need to open our eyes to be able to see it.
I agree. We have a bunch of questions that are coming in through the chat, and we're running out of time. So if there's an important question that you want to ask, I would encourage you to please put it in the questions where I am monitoring the conversation. But we have a question here from David Matthews. Is there value to looking at pedestrian-oriented spaces as assisting to give ownership to the neighborhoods? So this is something we've been exploring a lot with the Community Design Center, is this whole concept of walkability and how does that contribute to people who have limited resources. And I think that's one part of the question, but I'll open it up to you folks. Is there value to looking at pedestrian-oriented spaces as assisting to give ownership to neighborhoods?
Yeah, I'd say 100%, because especially in the pandemic that we're living in now, I think the research suggested that perhaps being outdoors, there was less risk of being contagious. So streets were closed and a lot more people were able to come out. And I alluded to the fact that growing up in Brooklyn, you know, we live in high-rise apartments, and when you come down, there's high-speed traffic. So the path from your house to a playground was actually quite dangerous. Mm-hmm. So being able to have that street closed, we now have ownership over that street in Brooklyn for kids to simply go out and be kids without fear of being hit by a car, right? And I just moved to Ann Arbor, and most of the streets downtown are closed and restaurants are spilling out, and people and kids are riding bicycles and walking and enjoying these public spaces. So I think if there's anything to learn from the current situation that we're in, it's that people crave spaces in which they can feel safe from cars and other more motorized forms of transit. And if we can learn something from that and bring that back into our current practice post-pandemic, that, in my humble opinion, would be the best way forward.
I agree. This situation with the pandemic has provided us, hopefully, an opportunity to experiment and try different things. But one of my favorite sayings is, you know, people on the sidewalk is what makes a place vibrant, not cars on the street. And hopefully we'll have the courage to try a little tactical urbanism under the guise of some temporary closures, and see if it plays out and how people respond to that. So with that, we are running out of time. We will share the questions that remain with our panelists, just in case any of them or I want to try to respond to them. But we really appreciate all of you being engaged with us here. We encourage you all to explore further some of the resources that Tony shared with us, there's just an incredible body of work that has been ongoing for, I'd say, at least a decade. I know that Howard Decker is a friend of Tony's and has known her for several decades. So there's a lot of people out there doing incredible work. There isn't much that we need to do to uncover it, to explore it, to try to learn more. So I encourage you to do that. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time to be here with us to have this conversation. It's certainly a conversation that has no end. We encourage all of you to continue these conversations with your neighbors, with your friends, in your family units. And again, we exist as a resource for the community, so let us know how we can help in addressing some of the issues that you see that are design related that we can impact in your community. We ask you to please take our survey so that we can continue to improve our programming, and we look forward to a placemaking conversation, Placemaking 101, Shaping the Spaces We Share. We'll have another installation end of July. So look for our schedule in our website or through our emails. So thank you very much, Kate. Thank you so much, Nana, for joining us. And thank you guys all for participating.